across America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and so grateful that you can join us. First hour, we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about prison fellowship, and then a little bit later, we'll have our good friend Gary Bauer check in. We'll have some comments from him. Next hour, we'll be focusing on probably a lot of focus on the war in Iran, but some other political issues you need to know about as well. And, of course, Friday is our weekend edition where we will bring in Dr. Merrill Matthews and Kelly Shackelford, First Liberty Institute, talk about some of the legal issues, some of the political issues, and maybe a few of the economic things that we need to address as well. So that gives you an overview over the next couple of days, but let's, if we can, introduce Heather Rice-Minus, who is the president and CEO of Prison Fellowship, individual that before that also led Prison Fellowship's advocacy team and was a leading voice behind the passage of what's called the First Step Act. We'll get to that a little bit later. She has contributed to many different publications. One of those is Christianity Today. You might have seen the piece a while back where she was interviewed on The Church Behind Bars is Alive and Well. We're going to talk about that because she's also worked very much with connecting churches to this project. If you've listened to Point of View any length of time, you know we've oftentimes talked about prison ministry. We've had different individuals here who are involved in prison ministry. We've had chaplains, even a warden, and some others that have talked about this. But of course, we've always talked about Prison Fellowship and are so grateful for the work that they're doing. Heather Rice-Minus, again, is a graduate of Colorado State University, has her law degree from George Mason University, as well as the other day we were talking about the Colson Fellowship. She's a Colson Fellow as well, and all sorts of great things that we talk about here on Point of View. So, Heather, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
We have a link to prisonfellowship.org. I would encourage people to go there because as we're getting close to Easter, there's an opportunity to have an impact, transform twice as many lives this Easter. Can you explain?
Yes, we have, a very a robust opportunity for events where we're celebrating Easter behind bars. There's actually a tradition that our late founder Chuck Colson started of visiting Easter every Easter. He would visit prison and share the gospel message. And so we're doing hundreds of events across the country to do just that and share the good news of the resurrection with our brothers and sisters behind bars and those who don't know Jesus yet. And when you come to our website, prisonfellowship.org, you have a chance to invest in that gospel message being shared in some of the darkest corners in our country. One
of the things it says is no life is beyond the reach of Jesus. He doesn't forget or write men and women off serving time. As a matter of fact, that goes back to that interview that you did on Christianity Today. And, of course, we are admonished in Scripture to do so, but even more so, there, I think, are more opportunities than ever because of the need and for the mobilization of groups like Prison Fellowship to go into those prisons and reach out to those individuals who are incarcerated.
That's right. Scripture tells us we get to encounter Christ himself as we visit those who are in prison, Matthew 25. And it is such a privilege to be able to be part of this work and to see what God is doing. And I know for those who have done it and those who will take that call up and go inside, they will be surprised to find that Jesus is alive and well in prison and that you will take home something that revives your own faith in the process.
Well, let's also talk about a celebration. We've celebrated, of course, 50 years of Point of View a couple of years ago. Just the other day, we had somebody in studio with a mission agency that just celebrated 75 years. And I jokingly said, and you weren't there at the beginning. He laughed. And, of course, 50 years for Prison Fellowship. You weren't there at the beginning either. But what we are talking about is 50 years of the really faithfulness of God through what you do there at Prison Fellowship.
That's right. We are celebrating our 50th year anniversary at Prison Fellowship, and God has done more than we could have ever asked or imagined. And our founder, the late Chuck Colson, former prisoner himself, he founded the ministry in 1976, really with an eye towards equipping the church to serve those who are impacted by incarceration. That includes those who are not only living in prison, those who are working in prison, their families. And now here we are 50 years later. We're not only engaging the local church outside of prison, but we're also partnering with what Chuck called the church inside, the vibrant expression of the body of Christ that's just as vital as our churches and our communities.
Let's, if I can, maybe just hold up for those of you watching online the booklet I produced a while back, and it's entitled A Biblical View on Criminal Justice. Now, we did so because it's important for Christians to think about this, and if you go to the additional resources, you'll notice that I mentioned one of the chapters in my book on Christian ethics, but then the other two books I mentioned, Chuck Colson's book, Justice That Restores, and then Daniel Van Ness, who was at that time with the Justice Fellowship, which was an offshoot of the Prison Fellowship, Crime and Its Victims. And so in some respects, Heather, I think it is illustrative of the fact that also if people come to our studio, there's a picture of Chuck Colson and Marlon Maddox. I think there's a picture of me. Yeah, there's a picture there. I can see that from right here of me and Chuck Colson. So our friendship with the Prison Fellowship goes way back, and we still quote many of those books that were written many years ago.
Yes, well, it's funny you say that. I'm sitting next to my bookshelf, and I've got both the books you just mentioned, multiple copies of them, and think the world of Chuck's work in this space, and of course Dan Van Ness is legendary as well, and started Justice Fellowship. When I started at Prison Fellowship, that is the division that I was part of, and remain very proud of the work we've been able to do. Not just to bring the hope of the gospel into prison, but to bring our gospel values to bear in the public square. And we have campaigns that we run both at the state level, at the federal level. You mentioned in your introduction the passage of the First Step Act. We've also been able to work on legislation like restoring Pell Grants. And just a few months ago, I was visiting two prisons, one in Mississippi, one in Michigan. And there are seminaries that are now receiving Pell Grants and inviting incarcerated people to pursue higher education, to become evangelists and ministers right in the prison context. And so this is made possible by some of the work that we're doing in the public policy space.
Yes, and we've had some people in studio talking about that. We've even interviewed one or two that were able to get their degree behind bars. Just an incredible program indeed. Well, we're coming to a break, and when we come back, I do want to talk a little bit about some of those key principles and, of course, some biblical principles as well, because we recognize that when we're dealing with crime, we also recognize there's a need for the actual punishment, but then the issue of restitution, which we've talked about before with people like Chuck Colson and Daniel Van Ness, and also whether or not we can make a program and a system more effective so that recidivism doesn't become something we talk about all the time, but we can really begin to see some changes. And again, the power of the gospel in the church, but also the church in the prison. I'm thinking of the interviews we've done before with Byron Johnson, More God, Less Crime, and we'll get into some of that as well. So we're talking with an individual who obviously knows a great deal about these issues of prison ministry and criminal justice. So we'll come back and focus on that for a few more minutes. Boy, as we go to a break, though, let me encourage you to go to prisonfellowship.org. It's our first link, or it's the link right under Heather's picture. And I would encourage you to consider what you might do to donate and to get involved. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Every few months, I do a commentary on marijuana because of new research that has been published about its potential dangers. The occasion this time is an editorial by the New York Times admitting they were wrong. You don't see such an admission very often. The editor said, "It's time for America to admit that it has a marijuana problem." They had accepted the view that marijuana was a harmless drug that might even bring net health benefits and that legalization might not lead to greater use. They have now concluded that many of these predictions were wrong. While it is encouraging to see this admission, the editors could have looked at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that 2 years ago warned secondhand cannabis smoke contains many of the same toxic and cancer-causing chemicals found in tobacco smoke and some in higher amounts. It isn't just the fact that many more Americans are using marijuana, but we all must deal with it. Charlie Cook explained that walking through many U.S. cities, we are forced to deal with the unpleasant and ubiquitous smell of weed. He adds there is a reason that the colloquial name for marijuana is skunk. He refers to this as pot anarchy because marijuana use has achieved a privileged status in America. You cannot smoke in most buildings and must do so in a parking garage. It is illegal to drink alcohol on the street. But let's return to the issue of secondhand smoke. That is what drove the ban on tobacco smoking in public. No such ban seems to be in effect for marijuana. And though we know the dangers of marijuana, there are no black box warnings about its risk. I commend the New York Times for its editorial. We all need to pay attention to the dangers they list. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to spend a little more time with Heather Rice-Minus, again, the president and CEO of Prison Fellowship. And Heather, one of the things we talked about just in passing that you were involved with was the First Step Act. Hard to believe that was it almost 8 years ago, but nevertheless was something that required the Bureau of Prisons to do some risk assessment to, if I remember right, have people located closer if they're going to be incarcerated to their homes, and evaluating some of the kinds of really almost draconian actions that took place in the past when we were trying to be hard on criminals. And so that was, I think, a very significant first step. But maybe you can talk a little bit more about some of the things that you have seen as a result of now many years of it being implemented.
My goodness, it's hard for me to believe it was that long ago, Kerby. But yes, you described some of the changes that were made well. And I think, what's been most exciting for us is to see a link of trying to incentivize rehabilitative programming and to allow people to earn the ability to move to supervised release as a result of participating in those programs. And unfortunately, the Bureau of Prisons has been one of the systems. We've got 51 systems across the country because every state is different. And then, of course, you've got the Bureau of Prisons handling federal prisoners. It's been one of the places we've struggled to have more intensive programming open. And so actually it's taken all the way from the passage of the First Step Act, which promoted the ability of faith-based programs to have greater access, to today, and under the new leadership of Director Marshall in the Bureau of Prisons, his Deputy Director, Josh Smith, to really open the doors for us. And we are excited that our Prison Fellowship Academy, our signature faith-based program, that's proven to reduce recidivism, has been approved as an evidence-based program finally, and we're looking to open a Prison Fellowship Academy very soon. And so we're excited to be opening the doors to new partnership, and really it's the work of that legislation and the implementation phase of that we're still seeing an effect on today. And this means more people are getting the support that they need, the deep dive intensive programming that they need, while they're in prison so that they can go home as good neighbors.
I forgot to mention that when you were Vice President of Strategic Initiatives, that's what you did, build partnerships with churches. And Heather, I know we have a number of pastors that listen to this program, Sunday school teachers, small group leaders, Bible fellowship leaders, elders, deacons. What would you say to them? Because some of them might say, well, we don't really have a prison ministry at our church. We wouldn't even know how to get started. Or we started one and it kind of flopped, and we need maybe some direction. Can you help us out there?
Yes, there's so many ways to get involved. I think a lot of times people think about prison ministry going in, and we've got support for that. We've got programs where we need church partners to help us volunteer behind the walls. But we also have our Prison Fellowship Angel Tree program, and that's often the first way churches come to partner with us. And you're actually serving the families impacted by incarceration, the children who have an incarcerated parent right in your neighborhood. And I know for me at my church, it's become a great tool to also invite people to our congregation. And we've seen that happen over the years as we've built relationships with these families and come alongside them throughout the year. And We also have opportunities to advocate, to get involved in justice reform. We've had pastors come to Capitol Hill to help us with that. And we're also building out training on how do you welcome people home post-release? How do you do that well? And how can you actually empower people to become not only part of the congregation, but leaders in your congregation? Because as we've been talking about, there's a very vibrant church inside prison, and we want them to continue living that out when they come home. And I would say all of these things are packaged up so well in our annual Restore Conference, the Prison Fellowship Restore Conference. We move each year to a different church partner, but we'll be in Washington, D.C., September 15, 16. So would love to have anyone listening join us there.
So again, go to prisonfellowship.org and you can find out about the Restore Conference, which is in the fall. If you click on the button that says Get Involved, and that's one way to do so, there's a place where individuals can get involved, a place where church leader or staff can get involved, and a third one, which I need to mention, which we don't talk about too often, businesses. I do know of some businesses that have chaplains on their staff or have a desire to reach out in the community in one way or another, and so there's a place for you to partner with Prison Fellowship. But Heather, I'd be remiss if I didn't come back to the fact you just mentioned one that I think most people know Prison Fellowship for. That's Angel Tree. But even though we're far away from Christmas, that's why I wanted to focus on the fact that there's some things you can do right now for Easter. But nevertheless, let's talk about that, because that sometimes is the entry point for a lot of individuals into Prison Fellowship, isn't it?
That's right, and it's the entry point for a lot of our churches as well. And so, yes, there's our primary program that we're doing at Christmas time, and that hopefully though becomes a door opener, that Christmas present to a ministry of presence. And what I get excited about, Kerby, is seeing churches come alongside families all year round. So you deliver a Christmas gift on behalf of an incarcerated parent, a mom or dad in prison. You affix a note to that gift on behalf of that parent. So that gift is really coming from them. But then that can become such a door opener to saying, how can we support you beyond this Christmas gift? And how would you be interested in coming to kids' church? Would you be interested? We run a Celebrate Recovery. Would that be of service to you? We have a youth group. We've got a food pantry, all of those kinds of things. And so at our church, we've had the privilege of volunteering right here in Washington, D.C. And actually, there's an Angel Tree family that we've been serving for 5 years that's become like family to our own. And they've actually, begun starting to come to our church. And I've even had the privilege of having driven them down to visit their incarcerated dad for the first time and having to be a fly on the wall for that reunion. And they had not seen their dad in person in 15 years. And so Angel Tree is so much more than just Christmas.
Might you mention, too, there's, of course, the Angel Tree camping. There are the STEM camps, the sports camps. You can click on that button that says Family and find out about that. Of course, the one on justice, which we've mentioned just a minute ago. There's also the one on reentry, which I thought I might mention because some might say, I have some people in the community and I'd like to get them into church and I'd like to help them get on their feet. And again, they might be saying, I want to help, but I don't know what to do. But you've had 50 years of experience to figure out how to do that in the most effective way.
That's right. And, it really starts, the most important thing you can do is be a source of community and belonging for people coming home. And that's what the church should do. And speaking of, timeliness, we've got Easter coming up. Also, Prison Fellowship actually started celebrating April as Second Chance Month in 2017. And Kerby, I can remember our marketing team saying, can we just do that? Can we claim a month? And I said, well, let's give it a shot. And it's actually taken on a life of its own. We've had presidents every year do Second Chance Month proclamations, governors across the country. But my favorite part is that we've had more and more church partners who have been using the toolkit you can find online under Reentry Second Chance Month to actually host a Second Chance Sunday and preach on the message of redemption, preach on the importance of welcoming home people from prison and how we've all received a second chance as believers, as we've, accepted Christ.
Well, let me again just say that one of the key elements here is to simply go to prisonfellowship.org and find some of the resources there. For those of you interested in my little booklet on criminal justice, we mailed it out in the past to those of you that were donors, but I believe we have a PDF that's available online as well because we are convinced that if we're going to make a difference, as I've mentioned before, there's some great books I can recommend by Chuck Colson, Daniel Van Ness, and many others, not to mention our good friends at, of course, Breakpoint and a variety of other places. So, Heather, I'm excited about you being in that position. I thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me.
Again, prisonfellowship.org is your key contact, and it simply just go to that website, and then you can scroll down. If you just are asking a fundamental question, just click on the button that says contact, and they can contact you. But again, if you're a pastor, or if you're a leader, or you are involved in some kind of ministry already, there's a great way to connect up. Just before we take a break, though, one of the things we've been doing over the last couple of days, and it's become a big issue in Congress right now, especially in the United States Senate, is the so-called SAVE Act. The SAVE Act, if you are not familiar, which we've talked about before, stands for Safeguarding American Voter Eligibility Act. It is something that has passed the House, now gone to the Senate. And there is a real need to encourage your senators to vote for it. And even if you are in one of those states where your senator has made it very clear they're not, I think they still need to hear from you as well. Again, requiring citizenship for those who are registering. If you already register, it's not even going to affect you as far as I understand, but you're going to have to show an ID, and you have to show an ID to do just about anything in this country. We're not asking for anything that's too draconian or difficult. And again, it has already passed the House, but the Senate seems to be dragging its feet. So if you have not contacted your two senators, we give you a suggested letter. And all you need to do is fill out the information, click on the button that says send, or some of you might want to print it out, put it in the mail. Either way, we encourage you to take action. And when we come back, we're going to talk with our good friend, Gary Bauer. All that coming up right after this.
It was President Ronald Reagan who said, "I wonder sometimes why we won't recognize that one book could solve a lot of problems for us." He was talking, of course, about God's Word. It holds the solution to our problems because it holds the truth. Did you know that between 2024 and 25, there was a surge in Bible reading among Americans? At last, people are seeing through culture's lies. They're tired of the moral confusion. They're seeking truth that they can live by. March 23rd kicks off Truth Team Week, a special time when Point of View highlights the impact of Truth Team members on our culture. But you don't have to wait to make a difference. You can join the Truth Team today. Help Americans find the truth they need. Visit pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151 to learn more. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, as I mentioned, we're going to have Gary Bauer with us now. Individual, of course, is the president of American Values, chairman of the Campaign for Working Families. Formerly, of course, was the chief domestic policy advisor for Ronald Reagan, was the president of Family Research Council, and, of course, had been the senior vice president for Focus on the Family, and still does broadcast in that regard. And Gary, welcome back to Point of View.
Hey, Kerby, good to be with you again. Seems like it was just last week. Wait a minute, it was last week.
It was last week. And again, yeah. I was going to bring that up. Who do we blame on this? Every time you are on, my wife afterwards listens to this and says, you have got to get Gary on more often because you and Gary Bauer agree on everything. You play off each other so well. And so I said, well, okay. I mean, he's a busy man. I don't know that we can ask and he can say no, but I think we even have you for a very short piece on Truth Team next week. So I never get my fill of Gary Bauer, and I don't think our listeners do either. So that's exactly why here you are again.
Well, I love doing it, Kerby, and thank your wife for me.
Okay, well, we did want to spend a little bit of time getting to know you. We've called it A Life in Politics, but I thought for just a minute, since we've posted a couple of your end-of-day reports, the one that came out the other day was about what happened in New York City, and I'm confused because I was reading CNN and it says 2 Pennsylvania teenagers crossed into New York City Saturday morning on what could have been a normal day enjoying the city during abnormally warm weather, but in less than an hour their lives would drastically change. The pair would be arrested for throwing homemade bombs during an anti-Muslim protest. Well, it just sounds like a couple of young boys, they just got themselves in trouble over there. And then I read the end of day report. Of course, we've also posted a very good piece here on Media Can't Hide the Truth about the Gracie Mansion bomb attempt. But this is probably a good example of journalistic malpractice, don't you think?
Yeah, it really is, Kerby. And look, that CNN story sounds like it was the beginning of a bedtime story for your kids. You know, I mean, it's just incredible how unhinged our media is. And it really becomes evident anytime the issue involves radical Islam. They just roll over and play dead. I'm still trying to process the fact that the mayor of New York invites one of these Islamic radicals, for Ramadan dinner, right? And instead of the police officers that saved lives by tackling the guy that did throw the improvised explosive device. We live in strange times. There's no other way to say it.
Well, and again, the rally had to do with Jake Lang. Now, I've interviewed him once when he was in prison over J6 and all of that, and I'm not agreeing with what they were doing, but these two individuals, one 18, one 19, made it pretty clear what they were involved because they shout, Allahu Akbar, they throw a bomb, and they were hoping it would be bigger than Boston, which I think was their implication of they wanted to kill more people than the 2013 or the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing. They were influenced by ISIS, and yet getting some of those facts are difficult, and there's a lot of misinformation because one of the individuals used to be the controller in New York City. Brad Lander said, well, I'm happy to know that our mayor and first lady are safe, but horrified that such a disturbing threat of violence outside the violence could take place. Well, the bomb was not aimed at the mayor of New York City. The bomb was aimed at the anti-Muslims. So if there's not a deliberate attempt at confusion, these people are at least very confused and are providing a lot of what do we call misinformation?
Yeah, that's the kind word. I mean, my father, Spike Bauer, would probably say a couple of other words that would not get him on Point of View Radio. But I saw a thing the other day about late night comedians since the war started, and there are 5 of them on various stations, and I think something like 90% of all the jokes they told during this 12-day period have been at the expense of the United States, the president, our military, our allies, etc. This is what they think is really funny stuff. And it's not ironic. It's just, I don't know what the right adjective is. If, God forbid, radical Islam was in charge in America at some point in the future, these 5 nighttime comedians that people watch that are making millions of dollars would be the first ones put up against a wall in front of a firing squad.
Wow. Well, let me just mention that next hour I do have a piece by Noah Rothman on what's gone right in the Iran war, a piece by Ben Shapiro, 3 big lies about the Iran war. Also, of course, we have also posted a piece by Gary Bauer on, of course, the whole issue of jihadists, border security, national security, and even tomorrow we're going to talk about sleeper cells, so we will get into some of that. But one of the things we wanted to do is let people know about you, and since you mentioned your dad, Spike, I remember a story I've heard you tell. You're watching Ronald Reagan give a speech, and at that time I think he was governor and then candidate for the presidency, but just generally speaking at the Republican convention, and you told your dad, well, I'm going to work for that man someday, and he was not convinced, was he?
He was not. I literally, it was a little earlier even than you said. Reagan hadn't run for anything yet.
Oh, okay.
He was giving a speech. As a Hollywood star, and I turned to my father and I said, Dad, Goldwater's not going to win the election, but that actor, Reagan, he goes, yeah. I said, that guy's going to be president someday, and I'm going to work for him in the White House. And my father looked at me and said, Gary, you're nuts. Well, he was able to visit me in my office in the West Wing of the White House about a year and a half before my father passed away. And he said, do you remember that night in our living room when you said you'd end up here? I responded vaguely, Dad. I didn't want to, rub it in. And he said, what a country where Spike Bauer, the janitor's son, can end up working for the President of the United States.
What a great story. Well, let's see if we can talk a little bit more, because I believe, if I'm right, that you and Carol met during the campaign. But finish that off, because in some respects you decided to first work for a campaign for Ronald Reagan, and then you were Undersecretary of Education, later Chief Domestic Policy Advisor. How did all that come about?
Yes. So I joined the campaign in 1980. I tried for months to join it and couldn't get in, but then I wrote an editorial that got run in one of the local newspapers, and they called me and said, hey, we're looking for guys like you for the campaign. I go, really? So I ended up working for the campaign and then got a very low-level job at the beginning of the administration. But over time, I became known as one of the strongest conservative Christian voices in the administration, and that led to being Undersecretary of Education and then later running the Office of Policy Development at the White House.
I do remember when you were Undersecretary, maybe about the first time I remember seeing you, because I remember Bill Bennett and you going and presenting some of this before Congress. And I remember you talking about how we have these history books that talk about the Pilgrims were thankful, but you never said to whom they were thankful for, or else they were thankful for the Indians, and eliminated all sorts of issues. And I remember some of those conversations because we were covering those on Point of View, because we were seeing just the way in which there was a deliberate attempt to actually water down the religious heritage of America.
It goes at least as far back as that, Kerby. And of course, the fact that even then, you were covering this all during the career that God has blessed me with here in Washington to fight for faith, family, and freedom. It's been people like you and Point of View, and then my old friend who's gone on to his reward, Dr. Dobson, who gave me visibility and helped me do the things that I was able to do. So it's been a wonderful partnership, and hopefully, when this battle's over, we will have kept America and restored it as one nation under God.
Well, let's take a break, and we come back. Obviously, we're talking about, if you go to the website, some of the issues of restoring America's godly heritage from 1776 to 2026. And I would love to get a few more comments about that, because Gary, of course, was in the White House, but also at the Family Research Council. Of course, we talk about focus on the family, and even now, just some of the great opportunities that he's had to write editorials, to actually do broadcasts, and all of the rest. So if you are interested in knowing a little bit more about Gary Bauer, we certainly have all sorts of information there today. We, of course, have his picture, and that will take you to a couple of places. Campaign for Working Families. If you click on the end-of-day reports, that will take you to Our American Values, and we've got two of the end-of-day reports. You've heard me say before, this is must-reading, and there's a place on that particular printout there for you to sign up and receive it in your inbox every single day. Let's take a break. We'll talk a little bit more about Gary Bauer and his impact right after these important messages.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Gary Bauer with us for just a few more minutes. Again, President of American Values, and I might just mention that you have 3 grown children. And by the way, I might just mention that later this month we have Zachary Bauer on to talk about Passages, and we've also had your daughter on to talk about her book. So in some respects, the family tradition continues, doesn't it?
It does, but you were speaking of your wife a little earlier, and Carol was asking me last night at dinner, why why doesn't Kerby ever have me on Point of View? So, so she didn't actually say that, but it really has been very kind of you, Kerby, to also have some of my family members on who are in their own way, making a name for themselves and fighting for things that we all care about.
Well, we'll talk more about Passages, which is an organization I really love, getting young people to see what is happening in Israel. And boy, the misconfusion there is tremendous. As a matter of fact, there's a piece we have coming out tomorrow on all the myths associated with Israel. But since we did want to continue for just a minute, we've talked about, of course, being on Reagan's administration. And I mentioned the Family Research Council. I'm old enough to remember when Jerry Regier started that, because I was at Georgetown in 80-81, so I got to know him pretty well. And then when he stepped down, you took over, and you were the president of the Family Research Council, and the connection between that and Focus on the Family was so great. And I can remember Jim Dobson, Peb Jackson, and others talking about what an incredibly gifted spokesperson was Gary Bauer. And Peb Jackson used to say, you could get your stopwatch out, and he could give you a 40-second soundbite. He is a master at this kind of thing. And these are people that you and I knew and Focus on the Family. And I just think it's important for our younger listeners to recognize that there's quite a bit of history when we bring on Gary Bauer. You've been in the fight for a long, long time.
It has been a while. Yes, it has. So those that have known me personally, Kerby, know I think it's fair to say I'm a little on the short side. But I just want to tell your audience that when I first came to Washington, I think it was sometime in the late 1800s, I was 6'3", and this is all that's left after all these years of fighting for faith, family, and freedom.
Yeah. I might just mention, too, since we are talking about that, I remember one time when George Will was talking about people running for the presidency, and you were one of those, and he said, if Gary Bauer is elected, he will be one of the shortest presidents, right up there with, I guess, James Madison. I think he was the shortest president we've had. So even then, some people were writing about you. But by running for the presidency and getting involved in that regard, you have found and have entree everywhere. I saw a picture the other day of you standing next to the Resolute desk with Donald Trump, and I don't think that was photoshopped. I think you really were there. And as a result, you have access, which is something we've benefited all these years from, an individual that knows these people, talks to these people, sometimes debates these people, and as a result, really gives us a sense to have the eyes and ears of what's happening in Washington, D.C.
Well, thanks, Kerby. It really has been a remarkable career that God has given me. I'd love to be able to say that when I made that boast in my living room so many years ago, I had a big plan. I was going to do all these different things. But really, a person without any faith would look at my life and say, wow, serendipity, what a bunch of breaks. That was... you really were lucky. I see it quite differently. I think God opened a lot of doors, and I've tried when I've gone through those doors to never forget where the opportunities really came from and why I'm in the battle. And it's not for fame or fortune. It's just that, as you know, America can't be great again unless it's godly again, and that's what I've tried to promote all my life.
For sure. Just before we let you go, one of the things we're going to talk about after we let you go is we've been encouraging our listeners to contact their U.S. senators to support the SAVE Act, because as you well know, they have my Viewpoints commentary every day. We have a video. I think we have the Charlie Kirk video up right now. And then one on the SAVE Act. And, of course, SAVE stands for Safeguarding American Voter Eligibility Act. This was passed 2 separate times by the House, and it's languishing over there in the Senate. The president has said that I'm not going to sign any new legislation until we pass the SAVE Act, and yet there seems to be a need to move people off of zero. And I'd love to get your thoughts, because maybe there's some internal workings that we don't understand, because it seems like about 80% of Americans, you can talk about the 80-20 issue, 80% of Americans are convinced that showing a photo ID when you vote isn't too cumbersome, and it isn't something that you don't have to do when you do a variety of other things in society. But yet it does seem like the SAVE Act is stalled in the Senate. People now talking about maybe even getting rid of the filibuster to pass it. But maybe you can give us some perspective on what's happening.
Well, that was a good summary. This, the narrative, of course, is that America is terribly divided and can't agree on anything. But the president in the State of the Union address showed that there were a group of issues that are 80-20, and we're on the 80% side. And one of them is this very basic idea that only American citizens should be able to vote in American elections. And the way you can tell it's an American citizen is if they just show any, legitimate form of identification. That seems very reasonable. And yet there are a bunch of Democrats in elected office who do not want that to happen, which raises suspicions. I mean, why would they be worried about people needing to prove that they're American citizens to vote? There's a couple of recalcitrant Republicans about this issue, too, which I don't understand. But like so many other things, it takes 60 votes to get it to the floor, and to get 60 votes to cut off a filibuster, and that's what we haven't been able to do, and that's why there are calls to make some sort of an exception on it for this one particular thing of voter integrity.
Yes. Well, again, I know that's something we'll be watching, but again, I would encourage people to get some of the end-of-day reports. We've posted some of those related to, of course, this war in Iran and, of course, all the possible fallout that might take place in terms of the economy, in terms of, sleeper cells. And we'll get into some of that as we go through even the next hour, the next 2 days. Those are going to be some things that we will cover as well. But let me just simply say that we won't probably have you on till again, and so you'll get a break now from us for a little while until the Truth Team. So this is a good opportunity for you. Number one, if you want to sign up for the end-of-day report, we've got a link, or you can just go to ouramericanvalues.org. But also, it's during midterms, and that's why we also posted up the campaign for working families, because this is an opportunity for you to find out a little bit more of some of the political issues as well, and even to support some of these pro-life, pro-family candidates. It's going to be a battle, and I think it's going to be questionable whether or not the Republicans will still retain control of the House. And so that's why I want people to know about what Gary Bauer is doing. An individual in Washington, D.C. He's been there now, you can see, for decades, and he's standing strong and certainly needs your support. So, Gary, as always, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Kerby. Great to be with you, and thanks for promoting the various things I do. God bless you.
Again, let me just encourage you. We've given you all the links necessary to get his end-of-day report, and I hope you'll send them a gift, because a couple weeks from now, we'll be talking about our need for financial support. But right now, we just encourage you to go to the website. You can find out about Prison Fellowship. You can find out about our American values. We come back. You would think the president should apologize for the Iranian war. We're going to talk about what's gone right, and you probably will only hear it on Point of View. We'll be right back.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places, and some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now
or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, the theme perhaps for this entire hour is the need for discernment. You've heard us mention that before, haven't you? And just because someone says it, including just because I say it, don't always believe it. Check it out. I think it is important to do so, and I've heard some speakers lately saying, I really want you to fact check this, and you're going to see this a couple of different ways. But a lot of what we'll talk about for the first couple of minutes will have to do with the war in Iran. Now, one of the lines that I use quite frequently, maybe I use it too much, comes from senior senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Daniel Patrick Moynihan was a Democrat, but he used to have a line that I think is so appropriate in that everybody is entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And when it comes to the war in Iran, I mean, I've got this piece here from Reuters that talks about the U.S. intelligence officials. They're all anonymous, tells you how much they really know, saying that the Iranian leadership is still intact, and this has been a real disaster, and we have soaring oil costs and all the rest. And so you would think, reading that article, listening to some of the people that are critical of Donald Trump, who are Democratic leaders, or listening to a lot of the legacy media, that this war has been a complete and unmitigated disaster. And if you think so, you would be wrong. We can disagree about whether or not we should be there. We can disagree about how this particular campaign was actually implemented. We can disagree as to what the possible goals might be. But you can't disagree, I think, unless you just want to turn a blind eye to it, to some of the basic facts, which is why I've posted a couple of articles. This first one by Noah Rothman. Noah Rothman says that for decades, the United States and its allies have been gaming out what a full-scale war against the Islamic Republic of Iran would look like. I don't know if you're aware of this, but they do what are called war games. By the way, the war games that they've come up with recently about fighting China do not bode well for any conflict we might have with them, but I digress. He says as recently as 2020, so again, I recognize it's 5 years, almost 6 years ago, in the immediate aftermath of the airstrike that neutralized the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commander, Qasem Soleimani, there were mainstream media and even left-of-center media outlets summarizing the forecasts of the war planners, and their conclusions, he says, were sobering. In other words, by taking out this commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, they were fearful of what would unfold in that particular time of 2020. Of course, it didn't quite happen, but nevertheless. He goes on to say this. In a war that the Iranian regime sees as existential, they argue that the leaders in Tehran, Iran, could be expected to pull out all the stops. I'm giving you a quote now. Iran's vast network of proxies would be activated. Then that means that American and European civilians would be targets, as would vulnerable U.S. military positions in Iraq and Syria, sleeper cells, and we've got a very good article about that tomorrow that Kelly Shackelford and Merrill Matthews will interact with, could carry out attacks against soft targets in Europe and Latin America. Hezbollah would roar to life in Lebanon, raining missiles down on Israel. Now, again, recognize a lot of that prediction came back in 2020. I've talked about all the things that have happened since October 2023, but I continue. Then Noah Rothman says the war, according to the scenarios, would escalate greatly, probably necessitating the introduction of massive ground forces to topple the regime. Overmatched in conventional engagements with U.S. forces, the Iranian military and the RIG IRGC would dissolve into a deadly insurgency. By the end of combat operations, up to 1 million on both sides of the conflict, including civilians, would die. That's the scenario. It goes on with some other things, which I would encourage you to read, because there's some quotes from Vox and a variety of others that give you this very chilling scenario of what would happen if we dared to really attack Iran. And of course, we've done that now twice. First, the nuclear facilities, now Iran. Now, Noah Rothman then gives you some of the facts. To date, the U.S. forces alone have conducted strikes on 5,500. That's 5,500 Iranian targets. That's according to Admiral Brad Cooper, in accordance with the American military's objective in the war. What is that? Eliminating Iran's capacity to project power across its borders. America's operational tempo is accelerating while Iran's is in retreat. The Iranian ballistic missile launch rate is down 92% from the first day of hostilities. U.S. forces have entombed much of Iran's stockpiles in those underground missile cities. U.S. drones monitor from the skies the cities that haven't been hit, striking them only when they observe Iranian activity. In addition, over 60% of Iran's missile launchers have been disabled. Then, he goes on to say the Iranian Navy is off the chessboard. According to, again, Admiral Brad Cooper, 60 vessels have been sunk, sunk, or rendered useless. So that is all of the categories, including all 4 of Iran's Soleimani-class warships. Those are the top of the line, named, of course, for Qasem Soleimani. All 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels have been destroyed. Again, when you see stories about Iran wanting to drop mines, some indeed have been dropped, but most of those mine-laying vessels have been dropped themselves. And 10 of Iran's 18 air bases have been hit and rendered inoperable. So that just gets you a little bit of an idea of what is happening to the military hardware. We'll come back to this because, again, one of the arguments that is being made right now, and I'm quoting again from Reuters, that the Iran's leadership is largely intact and not at risk of collapsing anytime soon. And I'm thinking, what particular news story are you looking at? The Iranian military units are maybe operating independently right now because there is no one there to give them orders. But we'll certainly come back and get into that a little bit more. Of course, the original supreme leader is no more, and even the son of him, some people have wondered whether he was wounded in an airstrike. And there's even one suggesting even that he's even more incapacitated. We'll leave that. But we'll come back and talk about the leadership, because we've talked about where we are in terms of the targets, in terms of the air, in terms of the drones, in terms of the Navy. But what about those in command? Are we to believe that particular story, or what do we get from the government? And I recognize not every time does the government always tell the truth. Not always does the media tell the truth. But I think a discerning individual, a wise and discerning individual, would consult more than 1 or 2 sources. And the more sources you confirm, I think the better you can actually confirm what is actually taking place on the ground. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Every few months, I do a commentary on marijuana because of new research that has been published about its potential dangers. The occasion this time is an editorial by the New York Times admitting they were wrong. You don't see such an admission very often. The editor said, "It's time for America to admit that it has a marijuana problem." They had accepted the view that marijuana was a harmless drug that might even bring net health benefits, and that legalization might not lead to greater use. They have now concluded that many of these predictions were wrong. While it is encouraging to see this admission, the editors could have looked at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that 2 years ago warned secondhand cannabis smoke contains many of the same toxic and cancer-causing chemicals found in tobacco smoke, and some in higher amounts. It isn't just the fact that many more Americans are using marijuana, but we all must deal with it. Charlie Cook explained that walking through many U.S. cities, we are forced to deal with the unpleasant and ubiquitous smell of weed. He adds there is a reason that the colloquial name for marijuana is skunk. He refers to this as pot anarchy because marijuana use has achieved a privileged status in America. You cannot smoke in most buildings and must do so in a parking garage. It is illegal to drink alcohol on the street. But let's return to the issue of secondhand smoke. That is what drove the ban on tobacco smoking in public. No such ban seems to be in effect for marijuana. And though we know the dangers of marijuana, there are no black box warnings about its risk. I commend the New York Times for its editorial. We all need to pay attention to the dangers they list. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just finish off with this, and then we'll get on to some other topics after this segment. But Iran deserves some time and attention, if for no other reason than to really think through with a clear set of eyes and maybe a little more logic and critical thinking about what is taking place. So that's why I'm going through this piece by Noah Rothman. I will also cover one by Ben Shapiro in just a minute. What's gone right in the Iranian war? We've talked about the military. What about the leadership? Well, again, he goes on to say Iran's leadership is dead or scattered. Its command and control is disrupted, as evidenced by the fact that there is some question as to whether or not they are able to even accurately send missiles to their intended targets, which is why oftentimes the IRGC missiles have struck civilian targets in the Gulf states. But I think it's also worth mentioning, you've heard a lot about whether or not one of the missiles from either Israel or more likely the United States has been so-called used to take out a girls' school. But first of all, there have been people that have looked at that particular because we can actually see the missile in the air and say that looks like a U.S. Tomahawk because it's long and cylindrical, has a set of wings. But that's also what the Iranian KH-55 cruise missile looks like as well. It's dropping at almost a 90 degree, which suggests that maybe some of that was due to the scrambling of the GPS. So even at a late hour when almost everybody is arguing that this was an attack on the girls' school in Iran, might not have been. And as a matter of fact, again, could be, might not be. But the confidence in which we sometimes have people speaking in the media isn't necessarily justified given what we know or don't know. Now, how should we respond? Well, I think Senator John Kennedy the other day said, look, we certainly, if we did hit an Iranian girls' school by accident, that was an accident. That's not something we do. But again, I think you can also say the question deserves a little more of an if. The more people have looked at whether or not this was a Tomahawk missile from the United States or a KH-55 cruise missile that went awry from Iran. But let's continue on, because he also says that this campaign is, interestingly enough, from Iran has been to spread the pain. And that is, you can see that as a result of this, instead of Iran wanting to target U.S. bases, they've been lashing out at civilian targets, diplomatic targets, as well as military targets, and it illustrates some of that as well. And one of the pieces that we will be talking about tomorrow by Cal Thomas was, what if any of those missiles had a nuclear warhead on them? You can see the devastation that would make as well. Finally, of course, there's the question about the disruption of oil. There have been all sorts of analysis of then games reevaluation, war games, to figure out what could happen if indeed a particular conflict, if Iran went on for weeks. The idea that the barrel of crude oil could reach $300 a gallon. If you noticed, it hasn't even approached the all-time high of $147 per barrel in July 2008. But nevertheless, we'll get into that in just a minute. And again, we can see that the targeting of certain kinds of targets have been places where maybe we wouldn't always agree with the decisions made by Israel, but that's beyond, in some respects, our control. And if we were going to talk about the disruption of oil, I wouldn't think any fair-minded person would think that it would be happening for too long, because think of, as we've pointed out before, how much oil China is dependent upon, and it would be against the best interest of Iran, and certainly against the best interest of one of their allies, China, to disrupt the oil flow. Which brings me to, of course, a very good piece by Ben Shapiro, The 3 Lies About the Iranian War. And he points out that, he says, from Democrats to elements of what he calls the so-called horseshoe right. In other words, some of the people on the right also are critical, are pushing narratives that paint the conflict as a disaster in making. And he says the goal is simple: undermine public confidence, turn what is shaping up as a strategic success into a perceived failure. And so he has 3 lies. I'll go through them fairly quickly. Lie number 1 is that the war with Iran is a quagmire. He says, look, as of this writing, the conflict is less than 2 weeks old, 12 days, I guess now 13 days. That's not 12 years, as in Vietnam, or even 12 months in the Spanish-American War. He says wars unfold over time, and no one should pretend to know exactly how long any conflict will last. But the notion the United States is already trapped in a generational quagmire after less than 2 weeks of fighting is less analysis than panic. So that's the first one. Lie number 2, Iran is somehow winning. I don't even know how you say this with a straight face, but okay. This claim is that Iran is holding strong, that the regime is weathering the assault, even gaining the upper hand. Just hard, even as the light of all the material I just brought to the table from the piece by Noah Rothman, to take that seriously, but let's get into it. Iran's military capabilities, Ben Shapiro says, have been battered. Its missile and drone infrastructure heavily targeted. Its naval assets have reportedly suffered severe losses. Leadership turmoil inside the regime only compounds the problem, and reports suggest that the death of longtime Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei triggered a chaotic succession struggle, and of course the son is the supposed heir apparent. And the last one, which I'll spend a little more time on, is what about the oil shock? Yes, oil, as prices have gone up, again, $100 a barrel is quite a bit, but after it went up, fallen back below the $90 a barrel, and probably will drop even more significant, because lie number 3 is the oil shock will break the United States. No, it won't. As a matter of fact, it might not even affect us that much, but it will affect other countries in the region, even other countries like China and India that depend on the oil that comes through the Straits of Hormuz. And so again, we'll see if indeed Iran is able to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. The biggest reason for the price increase is not because we don't have the oil, it's because of various insurance companies wanting to raise what might be a risk premium if one of those oil tankers does hit a mine or is attacked by some of the various bad actors in the region. But again, even when there was a concern about the panic of oil prices, they went up quickly and they've dropped fairly significantly since then, and we'll see what happens there. But again, the whole question from the president was, he made it very clear that any Iranian attempt to block the flow of oil through the Straits of Hormuz would trigger an overwhelming American response. We've already talked about the number of those mine-laying particular ships and boats that would actually be a part of that. And so as a result, it does seem to suggest that even that is one of those narratives, which is an attempt to scare individuals, but it's another one of those, as he calls it, lies. So the war is a quagmire. No, it is not. Number two, Iran is winning. Obviously not. Lie number three, the oil shock will break the United States. It won't hurt the United States, but it is perhaps destined to hurt some other countries if we can't make sure that oil tankers make it through this very short and small Strait of Hormuz, which is there located near Iran. I might also point out that one of the oil producers that have used the Straits of Hormuz, that is Saudi Arabia, are using other pipelines to get oil out anyway. So we will pay attention to that. We'll continue to monitor it, but again, everything you've heard about how this has been a complete failure probably needs to be judged with a little bit of discernment and an illustration, I think, once again, that you certainly need to cite and consult other sources before you even come to a conclusion, because everybody's allowed to have their own opinion, but they're not allowed to have their own facts. A lesson in discernment. When we come back, we have some other things that I think also illustrate, again, pay attention to the way in which the media covers a story, including a very good piece by Byron York helping you to use some critical thinking about the latest stories about the Epstein files. So I think we'll get into some of those as well. And if you find some of this interesting or would like to read it for yourself, it's available at our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll come back and pick off a couple other issues right after these important messages.
It was President Ronald Reagan who said, "I wonder sometimes why we won't recognize that one book could solve a lot of problems for us." He was talking, of course, about God's Word. It holds the solution to our problems because it holds the truth. Did you know that between 2024 and 25 there was a surge in Bible reading among Americans? At last, people are seeing through culture's lies. They're tired of the moral confusion. They're seeking truth that they can live by. March 23rd kicks off Truth Team Week, a special time when Point of View highlights the impact of Truth Team members on our culture. But you don't have to wait to make a difference. You can join the Truth Team today. Help Americans find the truth they need. Visit pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151 to learn more. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just mention tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition, and Dr. Merrill Matthews with us, and Kelly Shackelford. We'll be talking with Kelly about their case before the Supreme Court of the silenced evangelist, and I think that case will be coming down very soon. We'll be talking with Dr. Merrill Matthews about his piece, which is kind of a fact check on some of the claims being made right now about the economy, both pro and con, of some of the claims made by Donald Trump, which I think aren't necessarily accurate, It's certainly many of the claims being made by his detractors, so we'll get into that. Also, a very important bill right now that would try to deal with the issue of the cost of housing, which we've talked about before, probably could do more harm than good, which is being promoted right now by almost a bipartisan group of individuals, because Donald Trump first proposed it. Democrats thought it was a good idea. We all think it's a bad idea. We'll talk about the economy, along with, of course, some very good pieces. Cal Thomas, I mentioned before. What if Iranian bombs had nuclear warheads? What about Iranian sleeper cells? A very good piece that came out recently. And could piece, probably one of the best I've seen in a long time, in Christian Post about conspiracy theories about Israel, which deserves some attention. It's the kind of thing you'd think maybe a Ben Shapiro would write, but this was actually coming from some others, trying to just honestly look at some of the facts, which is, I think, why we do fact-checking. We're not necessarily a fact-checking organization, but it's something we've sort of been forced into. One of the articles by Dr. Merrill Matthews tomorrow is a fact-check on both sides. And now here's another one that we have posted. And you may have heard me mention this. I know people tune in and tune out, but if you didn't hear the interview I did with Gary Bauer, I did ask him about this post at CNN where it says, two Pennsylvania teenagers crossed into New York City Saturday morning for what could have been a normal day, enjoying the city during the abnormally warm weather. And then it goes on to point out they were arrested for throwing homemade bombs. Well, the piece that I've posted here come from the editors of National Review, very frustrated because they said, look, the media can't hide the truth about the Gracie Mansion bomb attempt. Now, where is Gracie Mansion? Well, that's in New York City. That is the home of the mayor. And this was an attempt to actually kill a few of the individuals who were in what I guess you could call an anti-Muslim protest. And as a result, these two individuals rush forward, shout Allahu Akbar, and throw these explosive devices into the crowd. The article we have shows one of them on fire. I don't know how they got that picture, although there were some people taking pictures at the time. And this improved or improvised explosive device filled with bolts and screws and everything, failed to detonate. They don't know as much about bomb making as maybe some of their fellow Muslims, but they were inspired to do that because of ISIS. And one of them even said that he intended that this explosion would be bigger than Boston. What's he mean? In 2013, you had the Boston Marathon bombing. You might remember that. That one took the lives of only 3 individuals, but injured many more. And it is quite possible that if those bombs had gone off, we would be talking about that every single day. But back to the headlines here, this is where the editors of the National Review said no one would have known about any of this if you only go by the headlines and the framing devices the mainstream media have consistently used to explain the story to American readers. He said, like it or not, most Americans consume their news in headline form rather than in article form. And he says it's impossible not to notice that all these headlines, or countless others, they say, from similarly situated media outlets, are carefully crafted to avoid stating a politically inconvenient truth. Islamic terrorists came horrifyingly close to detonating bombs in the crowd of protesters. And, of course, I pointed out, not only do you have the 2 Pennsylvania teenagers got themselves in trouble when they went to New York City argument from CNN, but then you have the former comptroller of New York City, Brad Lander, who said, happy to know that our mayor and first lady are safe, but horrified that there was such a discerning threat of violence outside their residence. Vile's display of Islamophobia will never be tolerated in our city. Now, it implies that, if anything, these individuals throwing the bomb were part of the individual that were holding the Stop the Islamic Takeover of New York City protest, and they were not. So if you were just trying to even get the facts of the story, you would have some real difficulty doing so. So let me just mention that we've posted some of the very good pieces by Gary Bauer. One of those on the New York City terror attack was actually the day before, but we have also posted one from Tuesday, one from Wednesday. This also talks about the danger of some of these terrorist attacks and a variety of issues, the concern about sleeper cells, which we will probably focus on tomorrow, and all sorts of other issues that certainly deserve your attention. But I thought while we're looking and trying to analyze media coverage, I would bring you to a very good piece by Byron York. Now, Byron York actually is an individual that writes for the Washington Examiner. He's the chief political correspondent, and he takes on a different issue, and that is the latest Epstein mania. He says, again, many of those individuals that want to use the Epstein files and the revelation against Donald Trump point to a story, and I'm trying to maybe water it down a little bit because I know young ears might be listening, but the story is about a 13 or 14-year-old who was purportedly abused, and I use that as a, if you will, a softer word for what we're talking about, abused by Jeffrey Epstein, and then arranged for Donald Trump to do the same. Okay, you with me on that? Now, first of all, the woman waited 35 years to tell the authorities. Wasn't until August 2019, the third year of Donald Trump's presidency, and shortly after Epstein's highly publicized second arrest, incarceration, and then death, that this individual came forward. The woman says that it happened in Hilton Head Island in South Carolina, a very beautiful place, where mother worked in a small real estate office, claimed that that's where Epstein lived for a period of time, and that this allegation was where he was, that is, Jeffrey Epstein, passing her off to Donald Trump. And I won't go into all the salacious details because they're pretty awful, but you can read them for yourself. And he says there's a problem with all of this. There's nothing in the woman's story in the FBI documents that supports her allegation against Trump. Nothing. For that matter, there's nothing that establishes any sort of link to Epstein either. Now, my goal is not to defend Donald Trump. He's got people to do that for him, or to even defend Jeffrey Epstein. But the bottom line is this one doesn't work very well for a couple of reasons. Number one, the issue of Hilton Head Island. There is really no evidence that Jeffrey Epstein lived at Hilton Head. Mark Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein's brother, told The Guardian he had no knowledge of his brother spending summers on Hilton Head in the early 1980s. He said, "I would have known." Number one. Number two, there's the timing. This woman has said that the alleged encounter with Trump happened when she was between 13 and 15. That would be somewhere between 1983, 1985 time range. Virtually every account of the Trump-Epstein friendship takes place beginning in the early 1980s. And by 2002, before the Troubles, Trump said he'd known him for 15 years, which have been since 1987. So you're having trouble even matching that up exactly, but okay. There's something else. There's someone else in the figure, a woman who called Jim Atkins, playing a large role in this story. This is, if you will, a new name in the so-called Epstein saga. And that one doesn't fit very well. And finally, he says there's the woman herself. By all her accounts, she had a troubled life. She had a drinking problem, drug problem. Her mother went to prison. After her time with Epstein, the alleged victim accumulated a record of criminal charges, including drug dependency, domestic turmoil, and many more, and goes on talking about then the rap sheet as well. Bottom line is this. He says the short version of this tale is this. There's every reason for reasonable people, that is, those outside the company of the anti-Trump fanatics, to be very cautious about this story. The point I'm making is we don't know all the things that have happened. Don't explain, even try to suggest that I do. But I think it's a good example of where just a little bit of critical thinking causes you to say, okay, Hilton Head, the timing, waiting 35 years, an individual who has quite a rap sheet, not necessarily the unimpeachable source that somebody would want to have if you wanted to begin to challenge some of the things that may or may not have happened between Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump. We'll stop with that, but it's just a good illustration again why we should have some discernment. I'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Right, for a few more minutes, let me talk about taxes. I did not have to do the radio program yesterday and gave me a chance to work on my taxes, and it is good to get those done, and I'm submitting them to an individual that has some accounting background to make sure we get them right, and then we file them. But I guess I'm late, because it is amazing how many people have actually filed their taxes. Now, your taxes are not due till Wednesday, April 15th, okay? So everybody relax. But interestingly enough, I dug these out because I said this the other day and somebody challenged it, and I thought it was good. I said, I think a lot of people are going to be surprised by their income tax refund. Currently, if the numbers are accurate, and this is from a day or two ago, so there may be a higher percentage now, 63 million people have filed their taxes. Who are these eager beavers? Nevertheless, 63 million people have filed their taxes, 27.5 million claiming at least one benefit from what we could call the working class tax package passed last summer. That's the so-called Big Beautiful Bill. For example, you have 3.5 million people that have claimed no tax on tips. 9.2 million have claimed the enhanced deduction for seniors, and 15.5 million have claimed no tax on overtime. And in addition to that, you have about 690,000 that have benefited from no tax on car loan interest for vehicles purchased after December 31st, 2024. So the bottom line is that not everybody who's filed taxes have been able to get a benefit from the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, but 27.5 million have so far, and the number is counting. And I thought that was pretty intriguing in case you haven't heard that. And so, as I've said before, I think there are going to be some people that eventually, when they do file their taxes, they're going to be surprised by getting a tax refund that was larger than they got the year before. I think it's worth mentioning. Speaking of taxes, my last article here is about Meet Americans withholding their federal income tax to protest against Trump. First of all, I do run into people all the time saying, I'm not going to pay my taxes because I disagree with what the government is doing. Well, okay, give me your phone number so I can call you when you're in prison, because you've heard on many occasions when especially Dr. Merrill Matthews is done interviews with Dan Pilla. If there's anybody who does not like the Internal Revenue Service, it's Dan Pilla, and he always tries to help find individuals and help individuals find ways that can legitimately and legally reduce their tax responsibilities, or even when they have not paid their taxes, find a way out of it so they aren't going to go to jail. But nevertheless, there are many that are now very upset about this war in Iran, and others that have been upset for some time. So you can read the article, because I think it just illustrates again that I've seen tax protesting in the past. This one comes from The Guardian, in which you have Rachel Cohen saying, I'm not paying my federal income taxes this year, and her video on Instagram received more than 140,000 likes, which tells me that there are probably some other people thinking about this as well. She is a lawyer in Chicago, plans to put $8,800 she owes the federal government into a high-yield savings account instead, because she doesn't want to fund the wars in Iran or the Israeli war against Gaza, or even the immigration agents. So there you go. And she's part of, as this article says, a new generation of Americans refusing to pay some or all of their federal income tax. Not a new form of dissent. One of the first protests in the United States was, after all, a protest of unfair taxation. But it's also one that's gaining steam as Americans reject how their tax dollars are being spent under Donald Trump. By the way, Lincoln Rice heads the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. That's a mouthful, said that in Donald Trump's second term, more and more people are removing their money from the federal tax base, so we'll see where that goes. But if you wonder, well, when it talks about this is not new, it's a first form of dissent, that goes back to 1773, in which tax resistance was the Boston Tea Party. Now, as you know, there were colonists that protested the British taxation on the tea imports. So some of them dressed up as Native Americans, threw some tea into the harbor. By the way, I believe they even went back. Am I right about that? I think they even reimbursed the government for it, or for the individuals that lost the tea, the various individuals in America. But nevertheless, you've had some tax protest over the years. There was a tax protest in Chicago, interesting enough, which I did not know about, that nearly bankrupted the city. And of course, you have during the Vietnam War, you had celebrities like Joan Baez and others actually protesting. So you've had some examples of some of these tax protests. Don't know that it goes very far. Don't know that it does much other than puts people in the crosshairs of the IRS. But nevertheless, that's where we are today. So if you have not heard about tax protests, that is the case. I would recommend that you pay your taxes because, after all, it is your civic duty, and it is a good way to make sure that you don't spend the next couple of years behind bars. But I'll leave it at that. While we are talking about that, you've also had people really fearful of what this is going to be for the future. Is the economy going to come crashing down? And I would simply say that, as we've talked about before with oil prices, the price under Joe Biden reached a peak. I just found this out and didn't realize that the other number I gave was even close. But the price of oil under Biden was $138 a barrel. The price of oil in late February was $72. So obviously we can see that there has not been a supply problem, but access is a very significant issue. And as Gary Bauer points out in his latest end-of-day report that you can read, unless Iran turns the entire nation into a suicide bomber and destroys the oil infrastructure of the entire Middle East, prices will fall, and they did, and then they'll rise once again. And he says once the Strait of Hormuz fully reopens, the problem will be processing all that excess oil that's been out there waiting to go across it. By the way, Iran was not closing down the Straits of Hormuz. It was done, as I pointed out before, by the insurance companies, because the higher risk premium was something that many of these companies that transport oil did not want to pay. But I think we're going to get back to where oil prices are reasonable fairly quickly, and that again is an illustration of some of the fear and doom and gloom that oftentimes accompanies any kind of military action, especially when it's done by Donald Trump. But if we can calm you down a little bit, that is the case. By the way, if I was going to look at anything that would not bode well for the future, I would point out that in Chicago, where this oil protester is, the other day the Chicago Metropolitan Bank actually closed down, and the Federal Reserve had to go in and run it because of all the various loans, which are considered assets. You know, when you take out a loan, it's considered an asset to the bank, but all these assets are in all sorts of buildings that are empty and are non-productive. So if I'm going to worry about the future of the economy, it's going to be bank closures, not oil prices. But that's for another day. Nevertheless, I want to say thank you to both Megans, Megan Henderson for engineering the program, Megan Kitchen for producing the program as well, while Steve is off shooting another movie. So that will be kind of interesting. But I hope you'll join us tomorrow. It is our Friday weekend edition. There are a lot of things we wanted to cover today. We'll cover those tomorrow right here on Point of View.
I'm sure that you've noticed that social media is now filled with information generated by AI. Dramatic descriptions of politicians and music stars supposedly making statements about a current issue, leaning into the microphone, looking into the lens, opponents silenced. It's powerful, it's riveting, and it's all lies. Even several national television networks were recently found using enhanced pictures, meaning manipulated, falsified, literally not giving a true picture. So many liars, so much deception. Where can we turn for truth? Right here. From Kerby and the team at Point of View, we need your support. Please join the Point of View Truth Team today with a monthly gift of $30 or more. Together, we can shine the light of truth and dispel the darkness and deception of this day. Give now at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.